Hey everybody, welcome to the Sheepdog Project. Doc flying solo again this week, but not to fret. I do have a very special guest on the line, Miss Julia Dye, CEO of Warriors Inc., well-known author, and she has been nice enough to grace us with an interview today. Ma'am, how are you?
I'm great. I will correct you, though. I'm CFO.
CFO. Oh, I'm
CEO.
so sorry.
Is my husband, Captain Dale Dye, and he probably wouldn't like me usurping him.
Probably
in a brief
probably
military
not.
coup.
Probably not. But if your military household is anything like my military household, there's whatever is on paper is on paper. We all know who really runs the house. Let's be real.
Well, it depends on what we're doing, but thank you for the compliment.
Well, you know what, and that's you know what, that's something that we can talk about. Is you know, we talk a lot about gender roles now, and we talk a lot about the current generation and kind of how things have changed and how their outlook has changed. But I think a company like a military unit, like a household, like anything, I think if you do have well-defined roles, and I don't think it's about chauvinism. I don't think it's about sexism. I don't think it's about gender differences. What's your opinion on that?
I think it's very important. You know, Dale and I work together a lot. So, you know, we're pretty much with each other 24/7. It's important to know which hat we're wearing at the time. And so we know what our various roles in various circumstances. It's like, you know, it used to be that you were told you can be anything when you grow up, and all of us can do anything. Well, you probably theoretically could. I probably will never be a pro basketball player in the NBA, but in theory you could. But you can't be everything all the time.
Right.
So it's wonderful that he can be the boss sometimes, and I can be the boss sometimes, but we can't both be the boss all the time. That just invites stress. So it's not necessarily a superior subordinate relationship. It's just what tasks are we focused on, and how do we best support each other in achieving the goals we both want to achieve.
You know, I think you hit the nail right on the head. That's a lot how we approach things in our household. And before my wife Denise and I got married, I turned to the guidance of a guy that I was deployed to Iraq with, who I was very envious of his family life and kind of how he had a structure. I was like, this is a guy that really has it all figured out. And I asked him, I said, what's your secret? And he said, well, there's not one secret. He said, if I had to boil it down to one thing, he said several things, but if I had to boil it down to one, he said, you're not two boats going the same course. You're one boat. And he said, and only one person can have their hand on the tiller at a time. He said, and it's not going to be the same person all the time, because that's completely unrealistic. He said, but you have to have
no fun either.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and there's things that I don't.
There's times I don't want the responsibility. You know, and there's times that if you're on the tiller all the time, you're never getting any sleep.
Exactly.
You got to share it.
Yeah, that's if you look how a proper naval vessel runs. And I don't know how much time Captain Dye did at sea when he was in the Marine Corps, but I did a brief stint at sea, and obviously it's not the same guy steering the ship all the time, and it's not the captain steering the ship. Actually, it's other people steering the ship. So I think that is something that has to be recognized. But so tell us a little. Yeah,
I agree. I wrote the first book that I had published was a thing called Backbone, right? And it's history, traditions, and leadership lessons of Marine Corps NCOs. And the purpose of that was, I think, one of the best things we can learn and we can teach our kids today is small leadership. You use that all the time, and that's a family is like that. You have to have a mission. Right? You have to know what mission type orders are. You need to know how to motivate small teams. All of those things we need in our families. You need that in your church group, in your book club. You need it in your profession. We're called to do that at some point. And I don't think we as a society do a good job in teaching that or in respecting it. You know, we make fun of somebody if they're the assistant manager at Walmart. Well, they're on the front lines dealing with customers. They're the experience. They have to deal with all stress. Why don't we honor that?
No, we should, and we should give a lot more respect to leadership. And something I think that happened, I've seen this even emerge in the military a few times, and it will emerge, and then people will realize, oh, this is like the eighth time we've addressed that, and it will get pushed back down again. But I know there was a movement in the 80s of management versus leadership. And I know you're familiar with it. Yes.
You manage resources. You lead people.
Right. Well, that's
people don't get managed.
For me, that whole conversation culminated in an en masse ass chewing on top of a mountain in Dahlonega, Georgia, at about 3 o'clock in the morning. That this was in Ranger School. Some of the officers in my team, they'd recently graduated infantry officer basic course, and they were very keen on. They just learned all this management stuff, management, and they kept saying management. And whenever they would interact with one of the Ranger instructors, they would say, "Well, I'm trying to manage," and they kept using these management terms. And finally, the NCO had just had enough. And he sat us down in a group and commenced to just. I'm sure you could hear us 3 ridges over, but and I remember he summed it up in a phrase that I have. This was 1986, and all these years later, it's still pinned in my memory like it was yesterday. He said, "You find management behind a desk, you find leadership under a rucksack."
There you go.
And I think that's very true. But I think people don't understand. We become very caught up in the world today in not only in the management aspect of it, but in the committee aspect of it.
Right.
We want everybody to have no matter what, and is there always room for everybody's input? Absolutely. But in a family,
sure,
you're going to ask the 5-year-old definitely has some input on where we're going to go eat tonight, but or what we're going to do this weekend. But that doesn't mean the 5-year-old necessarily gets to make the decision. And it's the same with a military unit. It's the same with a company. You're going to value everybody's opinion, no matter who they are. But in the end, it's the leadership that's going to have to make that decision.
Right. Absolutely. And we actually want that. We want to be in this inclusive, very touchy-feely situation. But when it's serious, right? If you're on an airplane and there's heavy turbulence, you don't want the pilot to come sit next to you, ask for your feedback, and make sure your feelings are okay. It would not make you feel better or more secure. You want him flying the plane, right? If you were lost in the woods and there were 2 people there and one person said, "Oh, you're lost in the woods, that must make you feel horrible. What do you think about that?" Or would you want the person who says, "I know the way to the next village, follow me"?
Right.
Right? We want to know. We want somebody who has a mission, a goal, an objective bearing, right, to tell us what the next step is, because we don't know. We don't have the ability to do that at that moment. Now, if you're later on in the airport, you don't want that pilot telling you how to drive your car, right? Because we're not in that situation anymore. So that's why I think it's important to be flexible. Being the leader doesn't mean being the leader all the time in every situation.
No, and
so you got to be a good follower as well. You have to. We need to learn both of those things and value both of those things.
Yes, and valuing followership is something that I think tends to become lost, because there is no being a follower. You in no way diminish yourself, in my opinion, in being a follower.
Not at all. Not at all.
In fact,
that's how you learn to be a good leader.
Yes.
If you don't know how to follow, you're going to be a happy leader.
No, and it's in many ways more difficult to be a good follower than it is to be a good leader. And having been in leadership positions, my first leadership position ever, well, outside of school scenarios, but my first real leadership position in the military as a gun team leader and ultimately as a squad leader, section leader in the Ranger Battalion, I actually had it very easy, because these were guys that had been selected and had been weeded out and who wanted to be there. So I had almost no leadership challenges. I really didn't appreciate the leadership challenges that a lot of big military folks faced in having soldiers with home life problems and having soldiers who didn't necessarily want to be there and who weren't the best and brightest. And I did not appreciate that at the time. I didn't appreciate that until much, much later. And I also, it took me a while after kind of going through my evolution as a follower and a leader to a appreciate the fact that, sometimes, being on the follower aspect of it and putting that faith in your leader and being in the weeds and managing the details, that can be the more challenging aspect of it. And as a leader, I think the best leaders recognize that and appreciate that. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. You're on target.
So speaking of being on target, that's a great segue. We kind of jumped right into the conversation, but let's go back and let's talk about you and where you come from and your upbringing. And speaking of being on target, as I said, you come from a bomber family, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yes. My father was a B-24 Liberator pilot in the European theater in World War II.
Wow.
So that it's interesting to me. As you know, the new book that I have out is about a daughter's perspective of her father's deployment and return from combat. And a lot of military brats, and we think about military children, and we think about active duty children. But there's a lot more. There's a lot of us that were not only those kind of military children, but people who were children of veterans. Didn't necessarily experience what life was like while they were serving, but it still influenced them so much that unless we all understand what that meant to them, and many of them don't like to talk about those experiences with their children, we're never going to have a full appreciation of who they are, why they make the decisions they do, and what kind of person they are. So, understanding, we have such a small percentage serving in the military now. I think I read somewhere that you have a greater chance of knowing somebody who's in North Dakota today than you do knowing somebody who's active duty. It's such a small percentage that we are less aware of what those experiences are and what they mean to the people who through them, and how that affects their life and every part of their lives.
Yeah. What was
that was my father. He was not doing when I was born. He ended up working for the American Lutheran Church. He's one of the greatest men. He is the greatest man I ever knew. He's my hero. Unfortunately, but a great man.
What kind of growing up? And we refer to his generation as the greatest generation. I really do think that it's true. In not only because of the Great War, coming out of the Great Depression and fighting the Great War, but really forming the latter half of the 20th century, which gave birth to the space age, gave birth to everything that we see now in the 21st century. Really came to manifest modern democracy as we see it and modern capitalism. What kind of values did he instill upon you growing up? What was that like? What was his philosophy?
Oh, that's a big question. He was a great believer in tolerance. He was a champion of small. Is probably the best way I could describe him. The people who were forgotten, the people on the sidelines, the one nobody noticed in a crowd, he would find them and draw them out and make them see their value. It was such a gift that he had in doing that, and it was almost unconscious. It didn't look like it was an effort he was putting forth. Of finding the person in the group. It's easy, like when we're talking about leadership and followership, when you've got a group to lead, it's easy to see who's the real rock and rollers, the top earners, the top presenters, the most motivated. But there's usually somebody who's not quite sure yet, who doesn't know what they're doing in that group, and to be able to notice that person and the unique contributions they could make that they're not giving yet, and evoking them out and making them feel like it's a safe place that they are valued. It's a real gift. And he certainly believed in a life of service and gave that to us as well.
That is a gift. It's a rare gift, as you said, and I think it's that's a huge shortcoming, in my opinion, in corporations and in the U.S. military. That is a puzzle I don't think the military has cracked. When there have been several times that I have left the military I've been in it.
Mm-hmm.
I ETS'd once, then came back in, and then when I ultimately got commissioned, of course, I had to out process again, and then ultimately retire.
Right.
And as I'm sure you know, that's a long process of a lot of days of your final hurry up and wait of sitting in rooms and making sure everything is correct, so you're departing the service with all your records correct. And sitting in these rooms, as somebody who was a lifer and who I feel like the military gave me so much more than I put in. Hearing those kids who were getting out after their first enlistment just really disappointed in their military experience, and I wondering if there had been somebody, like you described your father, who would have been there to pull those people aside and say, you know what, you're not happy in this job because of this, but I see this in you. Let's send you to this school, or let's have you do this, or let's have you do this project. I wonder how many more of these great people we could retain in the military as opposed to losing them. Because we lose a lot of people after their first enlistment because they not happy with their leadership, not happy with their job, not happy with their duty posting, whatever it might be. And I felt that in across the board in the military, I don't think we do a good enough job as recruiting, although I got to give credit to the Marine Corps. They do a better job than anybody else. Hands down. But retention-wise, I don't think we do it. And I think corporations are finding that now too. When you hear about the fact that, this generation will typically change jobs between, I think it's 8 and 20 times in their adult life, even after postgraduate education. That tells me that companies they're not keeping people excited, they're not keeping people engaged, they're not allowing people to realize their full potential. And I think that's something that's lost.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on there. I want to just mention the fact that I have a PhD in military history and anthropology, and so because of that, my viewpoint is looking at societal systems and looking at the things from fairly broad strokes. And there are always exceptions to these rules. I think there's a couple of things going on. One is the smaller services do better than the larger services because they have the luxury of doing so. So I agree with you. The Marine Corps does an excellent job, and I volunteer with the Coast Guard. I'm the CIO of the Coast Guard Auxiliary Association because I believe strongly in the Coast Guard mission, and it's another small service that I think does better at both recruitment and retention. I think it's easier when you have a more focused mission.
Sure.
Right. So that's part of it. I think there's also culturally different expectation. You're not looking for a job, military or of the military that you are to do for the next 20 years. That's a goal for as many people as there used to be. To change in us culturally as well as in the corporate system. You don't have corporations that are committed to people thinking that they're going to be here 20 years from now. So do we group them? There's a different, shorter attention span, shall we say. So there's going to be a higher turnover rate in any industry today than there probably would have been before. And the military needs change as well. If every single person who was a private stayed to be a general, it wouldn't work.
Right. Right. Yeah. We need a lot more privates to be generals. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
We know we definitely need some
it's built in that it's not no job, military or non-military, is going to be the right fit for everyone. And for some people, it isn't a good fit, and they're better off not re-upping after their first enlistment. No. It isn't. It was even if it was great for them, it may not be continued to be great for them.
No, that's true.
So I think there's some kind of both ways. I think one thing that I like about recruitment, since you mentioned it, if you look at how people are recruited, let's just say in the Marine Corps and outside the Marine Corps, and what the advertising is and what the thing is. Most services are like, we'll pay for your college.
Yes.
We'll give you this. You're going to see the world. We're going to do. The Marine Corps never, ever does that.
Nope.
It says, this job stinks, It's the hardest job. You're going to be in the mud and the blood.
And you probably won't make it.
Guess what? That's right. Yeah. And we might even take you. I mean, you have to be the best to even show up and apply.
Yeah.
So it becomes, when we hold something up to be elite, to be special, it's going to attract people who feel that way and want to be a part of that, be the part of something bigger than themselves. Now, what can I get out of this? If you're joining the military because of the benefits, guess what?
Yeah.
There's a lot better benefits out there.
There sure are. Yeah,
right? I mean, you'll get some things, which is great, but and you could be an investment banker with a lot less headaches.
Absolutely. That's
So I think that approach is also really a different one. That it makes a difference. So how do we take that lesson and apply it, culturally here at home? I mean, when you are forming a group, when you need to bring people onto your team, do you do it by saying, come on, please come over and be on my team. I'll give you anything. Or do you say, well, I'm only picking the best, so I don't know if you can make it or not. What's the better approach?
Right.
It depends on your goals, I suppose.
No, and you brought up an excellent point early on when you talk about, the smaller services can afford to be more selective. So it's a little bit easier for them to do that. And I understand that, the Army has quotas to fill, the Navy has quotas to fill, the Air Force has quotas to fill. I honestly think that out of all the services, I think the Army, well, and you probably hit the nail on the head, and I don't think it's something I had ever really considered, that because we're the largest service, I think our recruiting is the absolute worst, because it's like, come to the dark side, we have snacks, is basically what is basically our recruiting pitch, right? We've got the college fund.
And there's so many jobs, and there's so many different things. I one time, I was at this bar, and it was an officers club, and Dale was at the bar with some aviators, and I was sitting with some pretty high mucky mucks at this table having a drink, and this man who was sitting next to me was clearly a highly decorated Marine, and we were chatting about things, and I asked him, what was his job in the Marine Corps, and his response was quite simple. He said, I'm a rifleman, which is the proper response for any Marine.
Sure.
Because they're small enough, every single Marine is a rifleman.
Yes.
And then he paused and looked at me and said, I also have collateral duty as a commandant. That was a classic Marine Corps response.
Right.
And they hold to that, every Marine a rifleman. In one time, we went down to Camp Pendleton because their group getting ready to go over to Iraq, and it was their send-off event, and they wanted to be able to speak. And it was very funny because it was the band. They had gotten deployed to be riflemen.
Wow. Because
even if you're in the band, you have to be ready to go to combat. And they were, it's kind of funny. Others were kind of mad at them because they had far more sharpshooters and excellent marksmen, because they didn't have that much to do other than go to the range. So they were all really good. But there was a band going on war.
Yeah, that's something I think, and again, the scale of the service I think has a lot to do with it.
Absolutely.
That's definitely something you don't see the level of physical fitness in non-combat arms in the Army. Typically, you don't see the level of
you don't see the level of fitness in American children who might joining. We don't have enough of them. And if we don't start fixing that, we're not going to have anybody who qualifies.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big problem going, all way back to square one now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Moving forward.
Not to interrupt. I think, if we're talking about branches of service, it's, again, easy to get very general. I think the lesson, whether you're talking about civilian life or military life, it isn't so much the size. That's like saying, Google than small businesses, which is also true. I think it's to do with the scope of the mission rather than the size of the service. Even within the Army, within the Navy, you have units that have very specific, difficult missions that don't have the same problems as, say, the Army in general. Right?
True. Very true.
I don't. right? So those, more respected, more elite, more focused units within those larger tribes don't have the same issues. So I think it's less about the scope of the service as it is about the focus of the mission. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It does make sense. And, you're, because of your educational background, you're uniquely qualified to address this, I feel. Every couple of years, somebody has to bring up, everything's exactly like the fall of the Roman Empire. Everything's always exactly,
right, sure.
It's always exactly like the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Every couple of years.
Right.
But,
yes.
No empires, the Romans had their turn, the Carthaginians, the Romans, whoever, the Holy Roman Empire, Great Britain, whoever you're talking about, everybody had their turn on top. And certainly now, we're looking, and you're hearing all that again. Oh, it's exactly like the fall of the Roman Empire. Our kids are too fat to serve in the military, and
right,
whatever
sure.
whatever it might be.
Television is breads and circuses.
yes, yeah. Television.
Of course.
The parallels are always exactly the same, and every couple of years, somebody thinks they're the first person to think of this, and they have to bring it up.
Right.
So talk.
Well, empires come and go, but one reason that empires fall is because they become calcified and they don't embrace change. And one thing that the United States has done particularly well is remain flexible. And I don't think our republic would be necessarily recognizable to founding fathers, who probably never imagined it would be this large and this complicated. So that we got that going for us. The thing that was genius about our founding fathers and my father, if we can bring those together, is that they anticipated change, right? That there was a process in which there was checks and balances, a process in which laws could change, in which the Constitution could change, that was not found in most empires.
Right.
Right. That an empire, by its definition, would have sort of at least a theoretical emperor and a structure that they tended to expand and expand and expand, and then fall back in on itself at the life cycle of that organism that was created. And we're a different kind of organism. There's never been anything quite like this. And I think that's, to our benefit if we can not lose it, right? I think one of my favorite things about the national anthem is that the last line of the first verse is a question, right? And people don't think about it that way. But does that flag fly over the home of the free? The free and the home of the brave, right? It's a question. Does it? Are we still that? And every generation has to ask themselves, are we the land of the free and the home of the brave? And what does that mean to us? Because we think about those in different ways. So how are we defining it for our generation? And it's a question.
No,
right?
That's deep. And if you think about the fact that, so far we have been able to react to that change. If you think about how young we are as a nation, it's pretty, I work with James Holland, and, he talks about it. He's like, you guys aren't even teenagers yet over there. In the UK, they look at us, oh, how cute, the junior high school kids type thing,
right?
Because it is.
But they've had to, the British Empire, once the sun never set on it, they've certainly been through plenty of changes,
right?
And where their empire has gone. And if they had not embraced the Commonwealth system and allowed Canada and Australia and so autonomy, would there be a British Empire? Would there be a Britain any longer?
No, they haven't, and they've had to, more in a reactionary fashion, kind of react to that change, and begrudgingly go along with it. But had they been hardliners,
they wouldn't be here.
There certainly wouldn't be a royal family anymore. Scotland, Ireland, Wales would be independent states. They would all be these small independent states. And, it'd be...
Chances are likely. I mean, who knows what happened? A great leader might have stepped up to the plate and helped. But the beautiful thing about our Constitution is that a crazy leader can't hurt it that badly. Right? Because any kind of system is going to work with a fabulous leader in charge. Mm-hmm. You can have, a tyrant who is benevolent and works for the people, but his son made a complete jerk. So it's the system of not how well you do under a good leader, but how you survive under a bad leader. Mm-hmm. That's really the test of a nation. Mm-hmm. Or a family, or a group of any kind, or a team.
And I think I talked about Rome before, and I think Rome illustrated that probably better than any other empire in history. You did have people tend to lump the term Caesar with only the bad Caesars, but you had good Caesars. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the Roman Empire did well under the good Caesars, not so well under the bad Caesars.
And so did the Romans. Mm-hmm. I had a history teacher in college once who would talk about what it would feel like if you were living at that time, and he always said most Americans would be most comfortable living as a Roman citizen. Mm-hmm. That the variety and the hygiene and the potable water and all of the things in the daily life in ancient Rome was most similar to what life would be like as an American today. Most times in the past, people want to go to a medieval time, pretend they're back in those days. They would not have been happy if they were alive at that time, most likely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So it's interesting to sort of think about how did that system of government come about and how the people manage. It's like Life of Brian, Monty Python. What did the Romans ever do for us? They gave us education besides that, right?
Yeah.
They kept listing,
Yeah. So let's talk about your books. So we'll start with the most recent, and we can branch out from there.
Great.
So, Through My Daughter's Eyes is the title correct?
That is correct.
What was?
Well, how it ties into what we're talking about is because it is the story of a man, excuse me, and his family before his deployment, during, and when he returns, and excuse me. One of the things we're talking about, people in the military do understand about what they signed up for, the life of service, and it's easy to feel like, not easy, but it's a number of people can accept that I am both this military person and a family person, mm-hmm. and I can handle both roles, mm-hmm. right? But wouldn't necessarily have seen it through the eyes of their children. So this is that story as told by a middle school girl talking about her family life and her father's work and what happens to that family before, during, and after. So I don't think there's been a lot of seeing it from that perspective. So this is Abby's story, and she's the narrator. It's in her voice. And she talks about what goes on when he is there, when he leaves, and when he returns. And she's great fun and a great kid. But I think there's a lot of points of view, a lot of aspects about that experience that haven't been examined from the child point of view. So that's what I set out to do.
That sounds like a book that ought to be required reading at service academies.
I would thought that would be wonderful.
Well, I mean,
I think it would be. I think it's helpful. I think there are things about it that people would find useful and entertaining. So she's pretty terrific gal. And it's an interesting dilemma. It's an interesting dynamic. Military children are fabulous. Mm-hmm. They are exposed to more things. They have more, sometimes experience different cultures, different languages, different countries. They have a broader view of the world than most children their age. And they have challenges that are unique to them. And they also have every other normal problem. And they come from all sorts of groups, blended families and single-parent families and, constantly relocating families. But so they belong to several groups. They're not one kind of military brat. They're all as different as can be. But, from a kid, they're so fun to write because everything that happens to them is the first time it's ever happened in the history of the world, right?
Yes.
So things have more meaning and things are more dramatic. And they work for us. But I think as adults, we tend to forget how important these things are and how deeply they feel things.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. Having raised my two boys were a little bit sheltered because they came along later in my life, so they were sheltered for a large part from a lot of the normal military brat type stuff because I'd already been commissioned. I was already a physician by the time they were in any formative years whatsoever. So as far as, dad jumps out of a plane into the field every Monday night and is gone for the entire week. They didn't have to go through that, but I certainly
still who you were and how you relate to them was absolutely affected by those experiences you had before then.
Absolutely, and I think how I saw my role as a father, I think had a lot to do with how I saw father figures within the military structure. I left home at 18, and certainly my father was my father, but that's in my opinion, a young man's formative years do not stop at 18, and we all know that. So, really, until I was a mid-level NCO myself, I think in a lot of the ways I was still looking upon a lot of the leaders in something of a father role. And a lot of them, I certainly had senior NCOs and commanding officers that influenced the way that I was a father later in life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So those things affect all of us, and even sometimes it's even grandparents or uncles, aunts. But those experiences are very rich, and it's a thing about cultures. When we talk about war, it really shows us what a culture values the most. And that's very telling to children. Know what you say, and they see what you do. And which of those things has the most influence on the child?
Right.
So it's what actions you take. So what are you saying to your child? Are you saying a life of service value, which is a great thing, and often a lesson that is taken, but service to whom? You're going away to serve other people while I'm at home alone. So are those people more valued to you than I am? Why is it important to defend that family, that country?
Right.
Those people. Why not me? I less. So to be able to how that can be shown in a bigger picture can be a great strength, or it can be extremely disturbing.
Yeah, and we all know that different military families handle that differently, and
of course, as they should.
Yeah,
because each family is quite different.
And some do better than others, and that's that we certainly I think there became. Because all of the things that you describe in your book are certainly, especially in wartime, are we kind of become keenly aware of.
Right.
And even in peacetime, a lot of those, there's still a huge segment of military kids, military families that are going through that I think, to give you an example, so during the 80s and 90s, in the special operations community, as I'm sure it was also true in the Marine Corps, we were doing deployments to not so friendly places for extended periods of time. I was going places for 6 months at a time and drawing combat pay. And it's not until the war hits CNN that it's a big war that not only the civilian population but DoD as a whole starts to really look up and go, wow, are we doing enough to support these families? And that's when you start to see, after 9/11, as we became engaged in a war that was at the forefront of everyone's consciousness. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Now you're back.
Okay. Sorry.
Had silence for a minute.
Okay.
No, and I think you're right in that, and it does change. And one thing that's different about our culture and war today that it's not the same as the past, is again how small the military community is, so that it's, even though that family has somebody who's going off to war, our country isn't really at war. Our military's at war.
Right.
So when you go to school, most of the kids don't have any context for what you're talking about. It's something they watch on the news, but it's not something that's threatening their family. It's not in their house. And it's not, we've gone away from the citizen soldier, from my mother, my brother, my uncle is serving, to more of a military caste almost. So that a lot of people in this country don't have any clue what it's like.
No, very true. If you think about...
So as a kid, you're even more isolated because you don't have that many other children that you're with that understand that experience.
Yeah. If you think about what the home front was like while your father was at war, and to walk through whether it was a small town or a neighborhood in New York City, the number of Blue Star banners and probably even Gold Star banners that you saw hanging in windows from people that had a family member off at war, and that unless you're driving in Killeen, Texas, or Quantico or Fayetteville, North Carolina, that's not reflected today, like you said. And certainly kids who are going to school in Cumberland County, North Carolina, or in Killeen, Texas, several, half of their class, say, is other military kids, so they have that commonality. But if you're in Sacramento, California, or if you're in Dallas, Texas, or somewhere else, they're not going to have that. Especially if their parent who happens to be serving, father or mother, is a reservist. They might have nobody in their school who can identify with what that's like, and their teachers might not be acutely aware of how to address that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And school counselors and so on. I mean, there's the people who a child might turn to for assistance, the clergy, their doctor. There's a lot of people that a child might talk to. Those people may not have this experience. And we're not, as civilians, we're not involved in war like we used to be. Nobody's going to the Red Cross to roll bandits. Kids aren't collecting peach pits for gas masks. I mean, there are ways in which rationing, meatless is ration rubber. There's no inconvenience for us when our country's at war.
Yeah.
And we're not involved. So that's even one more step away.
Yeah.
Than when before the civilians would be mobilized to participate, even if they didn't have family members serving. So there was an investment almost in the process, and that's missing today. You have people who care packages and people participate in that, but it's nowhere near what it used to be.
No, you don't see the trucks going around collecting scrap metal and things of that nature. I wonder if I looking at this from how people echelons above me must look at we'll say the global war on terror. If conversations like that come up, I have to imagine that there are one side is probably saying, if we have to resort to things like that, we're going to lose the support of the American public. But then there's a faction, I think, that, and I tend to maybe lean a little bit more this way, is if people are at home are making that if it's a daily reminder and they are making that sacrifice, maybe there's going to be a little bit more of a groundswell saying, let's get this over with. Let's get this war over and bring our boys home, because we are all and our ladies home, because we're all involved in this now, because they're making that sacrifice as well.
Yeah, it's hard to know what would happen today, but I will posit for you the wars in which the civilians were involved that happened up to, say, the end of World War II.
Yeah.
How have we done in every war since? Have we?
Yeah, not.
Have we felt like we were triumphant? Well, really.
Yeah. We continue to win
Well,
battles.
if there's a connection there, if it's causation or commonality, I think that having a civilian population committed to the cause and involved and invested in the results makes a difference for how we fight war and under what circumstances we leave. And how we feel about it when we come home. Are we, want to wear? Used to be a big thing after you came home, you'd wear your uniform shirt first Sunday you were back. Who does?
Yeah, I think, if you look 2002, 2003, 2004 time frame, I think you were seeing a lot of that, and we're definitely not seeing it now, even though we're still engaged.
Right. So it's just, again, hard to, it's in an egg, which one comes first? Are we less involved because we haven't had great victories? Hard to say, but it is interesting that they do seem to correlate.
Very true.
So, anyway, I would just to wrap things up. Would you mind if I read a short bit from the book so you can get a sense of it?
Please do.
Okay. Well, I think that this bit from the book kind of wraps up what we were talking about. So I'm going to let Abby speak for me in this summation. This is again from Abby's point of view, and she's been. She's trying to explain about what happened to her dad and what she hears and what she thinks about it. So here we go. When combat veterans come home, they tell stories. They tell those stories to each other, not even realizing the children are listening. These stories don't sound real. They sound like a baseball highlight reel. Here are the amazing heroic catches. Here's the home run I hit. Here's the blooper you made. There's little or nothing of the time in between, standing on deck, striking out, waiting on base for someone else's at bat, or even waiting around for the other team to show up. Remember, you can't have a war if the other team doesn't fight back. The player and the soldier, though, they both have the same goal, safe at home. We all tell stories, I guess, especially when we're trying to make sense of things that are senseless. Having a beginning, middle, and happily ever after gives meaning to the meaningless. It's almost impossible to go through something traumatic and come out the other side with a work brain unless there's some sort of meaning to it all. So they tell stories, and they don't always think about who might be listening.
That was perfect. I normally end the show on a quote. I'm gonna leave it with Abby's quote. I'm not even gonna try to top that.
Excellent. She says it better than I do, anyway.
Wow, she's quite a lady. Ma'am, thank you very much for coming on. We talked about a lot of stuff. This was really great. Hopefully, we can do it again at some point. I'd love to have you.
Great. It was my pleasure.
I'd love to have you and Captain Die Hard together too at some point if we ever get the chance.
Oh, sure, that'd be fun.
Thank you so much. Where can people? All your books are on Amazon, correct?
Absolutely. You can certainly find them at Amazon. Again, my name's Julia Dye. The books are Backbone and Through Minders' Eyes. You can get them through Amazon and other online sources. And if you'd like to know more, you can always go to the publisher webpage as well at warriorspublishing.com, where you'll see my books as well as a lot of books by Dale Dye.
Okay.
So check it out.
I'll make sure that there are links to all of those in the show notes. Ma'am, thank you very much for being on this today. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much.
All right.
We'll talk soon. Thank you.
Have
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
That was Julia Dye, everybody, author of Through My Daughter's Eyes and CFO of Warriors, Inc. Great having her on. Hopefully we can do it again in the future. Until next time, everybody, be a sheepdog.
You have been listening to the Sheepdog Project. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Sheepdog Response. The views expressed on this podcast are those of the individual and do not represent any larger entity, public or private.